afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Nate here at Common Good City Farm. I'm a relief assistant, and today we're doing our Instagram Live Sunday lessons. Uh, I'm here at the farm with Emily. She's behind the camera
Hey everybody,
teaching.
I'm going to show you the farm real quick. We always like to just show you what the farm looks like today.
Okay, well, today we're going to talk about the biogeochemical cycles, that govern nature and all the nutrients and energy that we use to produce our food and everything. Uh, that's a big word, but it's just common cycles we all already understand. Like the water cycle is something we're all familiar with. That would be a biogeochemical cycle that governs the way water moves through the ecosystem. But today we're going to talk about these cycles. We're going to talk about how our practices on the farm relate to these cycles, how they can go with them or go against them, and the effects on the ecosystem those decisions have. So that's it. I guess I'll start off by just again reiterating what a biogeochemical cycle is. They're the cycles that connect the energy and molecules that are on the planet, into a continuous loop. So all the building blocks of life exist in a continuous loop, being supplied to the ecosystem at different levels. Those building blocks being, things like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, water, all those chemicals, sulfur, phosphorus, different things that the plants need and all of our bodies need. So I guess I'll start talking about some of the practices that aid in these cycles. Specifically, a nitrogen cycle is a cycle that we're particularly interested in when farming because nitrogen is essential for the plants to grow. All the green leaves and green stalks, all those things you see on the plants that are green, plants need nitrogen to be able to be able to make the chlorophyll that they use to photosynthesize. So nitrogen is essential to the plants being able to eat and grow. Um, yeah, as well as phosphorus is then also essential to other later stages of plant growth, in the fruit of plants and those things. So those cycles we use things like composting and cover cropping to we use composting and cover cropping to supply nitrogen to the ground, which aids in a certain stage of the nitrogen cycle. So, like I said before, there's a bunch of nitrogen in plants, and when plants in our bodies die, they decompose. They're broken down by bacteria and fungi that feed on our bodies and the nitrogen and carbon in our bodies. They feed on those compounds and convert them into forms of nitrogen that exist in the soil that are more available for the plants to use to then grow themselves. So composting creates a home for those bacteria that actually do all of that. So when we compost, we're aiding the nitrogen cycle by essentially setting up the home in which the biggest stage of the nitrogen cycle can occur, which is all of our nitrogen that we've taken from the earth going back into the earth. So that's one of the practices we can use that goes with the cycles, and it has plenty of benefits to the environment. Being it also helps to sequester carbon from the air. These are things I'll talk about a little later on in the lesson when I talk about I'll talk about that later on. So I guess so. Cover cropping is another thing we do on the farm to aid in the nitrogen cycle, and what that does is something very similar. Cover crops are plants that we plant that bring nitrogen back into the ground indirectly, and they do that indirectly by a cover crop is a crop that is usually like a legume or a grass, and they have these nodes. Legumes and some grasses have these nodes on their roots, which house bacteria that are able to take nitrogen out of the air and put it back into the ground. So in order to get nitrogen back into the ground, you might plant things like beans, legume beans all over the place, and they'll bring nitrogen back into the earth as that plant grows. So that's cover cropping. Sometimes we use other fertilizers to get nitrogen to our plants, which goes against those cycles. It's not really a part of those cycles, and there isn't really a place for it in the ecosystem because it creates harmful effects. When we add other fertilizers to the ground as the rain comes. Like the water cycle. That's one of the parts of the water cycle is the rain coming, falling from the sky to the ground, and then it runs off into other bodies of water. As that runoff comes into our fields that we fertilize, that runoff goes into the oceans, and then that fertilizer is also in the oceans. And all these algae and plant life in the water that they also use those same nutrients. They bloom up. They have there's a lot of food for them, a lot of nutrients for them, so their population gets really large. And those algae use up oxygen in the water that the fish also need and other marine life need. So when the algae population blooms up, it takes away oxygen from fish, and a lot of fish die from that. And then it also has other harmful effects, and that bloom of algae kind of blocks light from other photosynthetic organisms that are beneath the surface of the water. Yeah. So those are some of the negative effects of using agricultural practices that go against these ecological cycles. So another big ecological cycle that's very popular right now is the carbon cycle, and the carbon cycle is very important to us because it's imbalances in the carbon cycle or what is responsible for for the global warming, the warming climate. You know, and the climate is only raising a couple of degrees, really, but that's all that's needed to destroy a lot of habitats on Earth and just erase a lot of ecosystems, which would then erase a lot of the life on Earth and a lot of life that we also support and we also rely upon, for our society. So, the carbon cycle is kind of being thrown off because of the way we meet our needs industrially, and we tend to do things that produce a lot of carbon and puts carbon out into the atmosphere. The way we produce electricity and the use of fossil fuels, a lot of these things put a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. Other carbon also goes into the atmosphere, and other greenhouse gases go into the atmosphere as well when we through the ways through the ways that we decompose or dispose of our food waste, and all of our waste really. And composting, which goes with those cycles, is actually a way to sequester a lot of that carbon and put it back into the ground, as well as it prevents the production of a whole rack of other much more harmful greenhouse gases that are produced when we allow food to rot. So, yeah, all of our needs, really, agriculturally and just in general, can actually be met through practicing methods that go with these ecological cycles. And yeah, that's just some of the ways that we do that here on the farm through the composting, the cover cropping, and especially by going with the water cycle. Because that's one of the most important aspects of growing of agriculture is having water for the plants. That's one of the main things they need, as well as all those nutrients we were talking about before. And we use a lot of rainwater here. We collect the rainwater. When it's a rainy week, we understand that there's been rain and we don't need to water it at all. And then when it isn't raining, we collect a lot of rainwater in these cisterns. You see the gutters on top of the hoop house. This is the ways we go with the water cycle and use the water cycle to meet our needs agriculturally. And all this is very important for us to continue practicing these means and just developing more and just having an understanding of these cycles when as we live our lives is going to be very important for us to continue, living our lives here, you know. So, yeah, these cycles have been a part of the earth since the very beginning. All things on earth are moving through these cycles and rely upon them. So we should really be mindful of them when as we go through our lives and meet our needs industrially and agriculturally. Yeah. Um, I can go further in depth about the various stages in some of these cycles, actually. Yeah, I think it would make more sense to close even further because, especially going back to what I was saying about carbon and the carbon going into the atmosphere, one of the best ways to sequester carbon, the way the carbon cycles naturally works is that we breathe in oxygen and let out carbon. and then plants taking the carbon and let out oxygen. So there's a lot huge imbalance that has happened in that cycle through the deforestation and through a lot of the loss of plant life. So then when we compost and use the method we use here, in the nitrogen cycle to provide fertilizers to the ground, we also are then providing those nutrients to plants, which then relate to it, which then have an important role to play in balancing out the carbon cycle. So a lot of these cycles that exist, be they carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, the water cycle, they all intertwine in ways that benefit one another or can be malicious to one another. Like a way in which the cycles can intertwine and mix and kind of be malicious when they interact is when we create imbalances in one. Like when we throw out the fertilizer, that then that has an effect upon the water cycle, where the water and the runoff is now polluted and causing issues in the ocean marine ecosystems. So, on top of understanding just these cycles in themselves and their stages, we also kind of have to be more aware of the way that these cycles relate to one another and use that as well to our benefit, and really just ensure that we're not allowing it to be detrimental, to our detriment. It's These are the ecological cycles. The nitrogen cycle is probably the one that's most important for us here at the farm, or the one that we kind of spend the most attention to here farming, because that's so essential to the plant life. Really, it's all just a large thing that works together. But as far as our practices, when I try to think about it, a lot of our practices are geared towards the nitrogen cycle and aiding in, closing that last step of the nitrogen cycle where fungi and bacteria are able to bring everything back to the earth. I think a lot of our practices are kind of geared towards that. I mean, this mulching does give things back to the earth, creates a layer of skin. This mulch actually has a lot of carbon in it that's going back into the earth, and other nutrients are going back in through the mulch. But the phosphorus cycle relies upon, which is another essential nutrient for the plants, that relies upon like rocks and mountains eroding from years of water falling onto them. So it's much harder for us to actually like engage in moving that along. So we usually do have to use fertilizers. There could be natural fertilizers also. Natural fertilizers for phosphorus that we can use to make sure if we have a deficiency in that, we could use those. And some of those would be, I believe, a lot of the seafood products, be it the crab meal or fish emulsion, just ground up fish parts, I believe. All of those are high in phosphorus as well as nitrogen. But I think it's because a lot of the rocks erode down into the water, and that's, so again, the cycles kind of interacting with one another. The water cycle being something that moves, that helps in moving along certain nutrients through its own cycle, helps in moving nutrients, through ecosystems. So the water brings it all to the ocean, and then it gets in those fish parts. We can use the fish and all the water the fish live in and stuff as a source of phosphorus naturally for our growing purposes. So yeah, these cycles have existed for billions of years. They exist on other planets too, but other planets don't have the same balances as us. They have their own balances. So our situation just came about from just billions of years of very simple compounds or simple elements combining and then bursting out from all the stars and eventually coming back together to form the planet that we live on. And all of these cycles they kind of move just continuously to keep life going. Everything's dependent upon it. We depend upon these cycles for our water, for our source of food, and that's pretty much how it is, you know. I mean, that is. To reiterate, we uh we can have an understanding of these cycles and the decisions we make, especially like here on the farm, we try to do that. It's especially important here because these cycles are, you know, uh, just imperative for us to have any sort of food, or water. We just have a have an understanding of these cycles and our decisions. We can promote a more mutualistic relationship with like our broader environment, and I'll just bring about many benefits. Yeah, I didn't really talk about why that relationship is even important. I guess I was assuming it was self-explanatory, but really it can cut down on a lot of costs. Composting and cover cropping cuts down a lot of costs of fertilizers and buying other things to try and amend your ground. We end up having to expend a lot of extra labor doing methods that go against these cycles. Whereas if you were to go with them, it would be way less costly, and far more productive, um, yeah, adventures that we partake in. Yeah, it can be when there's more things growing. I can paint the vivid picture of how one of these cycles relates to when things will start growing more. Well, I guess I have been talking a lot about nitrogen because that is the main one, really. And yeah, in the wintertime, I mean, in the springtime, when spring rolls around, all this earth here, we're gonna have to. We may put more compost on it, depending upon what we did before. But our main concern in the springtime is going to be nitrogen. Really, our main concern now is a lot of times is nitrogen, and there are other things we consider, when making decisions, farming wise, doing like a crop plan. I work at another farm, doing farm work at the farm at Kelly Miller, and I recently, the past Well, really, that's what I've been doing over there. I could talk about my experience over there a little bit because over there, our farm is just covered in legumes, really, and oats, peas and oats, just a cover crop, just trying to get nitrogen back into the ground during this winter time. So then in the summertime, these areas can just be ready to go. And the reason why we decided to do that is because we were looking at it and we saw, okay, certain things stopped doing so well later in the season last year, and we were like, okay, maybe we just give that stuff a rest and make sure we cover crop it to kind of give the nutrients back in there. The other thing we're doing, I've been doing for the past, since it started getting cold out, and, the whole autumn to now, I've been composting over there very consistently and just trying to make as much compost as I can right now, just so we can make sure to get those nutrients back in the ground and just eventually create an entire farm where we don't even have to put so much effort into helping with the composting process. The farm kind of works on its own. That we've already added so much compost and so much organic material and listened to the earth and those cycles that those things happen automatically in the earth we're growing in. And that's really where I think, we ultimately try to reach in terms of our agricultural practices. That's kind of, I guess that'd be like the pinnacle of us being productive and just being able to be productive as possible while maintaining our responsibilities as like stewards or caretakers of the earth. So that's kind of what my work has been with my other, outside of my work here at Commonwealth, the Leaf class has been to make as much compost as possible and then design this crop plan while thinking about all these things we were just talking about in terms of the nitrogen, the phosphorus, what went where, and listening to the earth and just making sure that we're making the proper decisions when growing, on top of on top of on top of just deciding what to plant. As we decide what to plant, we also come up with like our notes and write down any information to help us know how and what methods we're going to use to plant it. And when we're doing that, what we're considering is these cycles. We're considering primarily the nutrients in the ground and what we can get out of the earth and what we need to give back to the earth. It's kind of like a transaction between us and the ground, us and the soil. It's like when we get things like our plants, our foods, we also have to give back because those plants and foods are taking from the earth and we're taking them. So we have to give back, and what we give back are these nutrients. We give back the carbon, and these things move in a loop, you know. So it's about understanding that loop and having various practices that can just aid in that loop and help it to keep on going. And ultimately, the loop will just go on its own. The loop has always gone on its own. So you really don't have to, after you get it to that point and you jump start it, it's kind of moving and continuously. It's a continuous loop. You kind of take your hands off of it, and yeah, the ground will do what you need it to do, as long as you do what it needs you to do, you know, and that's kind of an important perspective to have, I think, when it comes to growing. I think it also speaks to other things in life, not to get too philosophical here, but you know, I definitely think that is like really that in these cycles is the key to what we're doing out here. And there's a lot of practical things as far as growing in the city, growing for different, you know, there's a lot of just like because of our situation and in this space we inhabit in terms of like society, um, there's a lot of things that get in the way of that being the entire focus all the time. You know, we have to do, you know, you have to do a lot of different things, you know, as far as our practical needs that may prevent us from fully, like right now, like we don't have any cover cropping, you know, in the ground. We may not need any cover cropping in the ground because the ground here is pretty good because Tracy has done a really good job of understanding that perspective and incorporating that into the way that she has kept up the farm. You know, we don't do too much of any of the adding a bunch of fertilizers or putting a whole rack of inputs into the garden that aren't meant to be there. You know, I think we do here a good job is done of going with the cycles. So honestly, it may already be, it kind of has been, when I grow in here, it's kind of been reaching that sort of point of already doing the work for you. Like at my other job, I do a lot of work prepping beds and stuff. When I come out here to work in the youth garden, I just throw the seeds out there. You know, I'm breaking my back all summer trying to get the ground at where I work at the farm at Kelly Miller good. That's because that's a new place in the city, and it's been those cycles and everything have been neglected there for so long. So we have to do work to kind of kickstart that and get that going again. Whereas this has been here for, we've been in this location 6 years, 7 years,
10.
10 years right here, developing, you know, this earth, you know. So I'm sure early on, a lot of composting, a lot of cover cropping had to be going on, but at this point, this ground gives you so much, yeah, so much without you having to like do a whole rack of work to really get it going. It's yeah, I guess that comes from, you know, following those cycles and doing that work initially, especially here in the city. You know, and that's why some of the greatest fertilizers for your garden is, according to George Washington Carver, was you know, just the leaves and muck from the bottom of the forest, because those are places, those are natural fertilizers. Those are places where those cycles have gone on and on and on, you know, for billions of years now. Just rich ground where animals have been, you know, all the nitrogen's been going back into the ground from all the animals dying in their waste and all the plants dying in their waste. You know, that those cycles happen there very well, just in places where we are not. And those are some of the most fertile places. So yeah, maybe go into Rock Creek Park and get in some leaves or something. I was gonna try that out on my garden at home, just see if I can go and find some any wooded areas and just reap the benefits of those cycles, because they've been occurring in there. You know, just hands off, just reap those benefits by going to those places, bringing back almost like a blood transfusion. You know, bringing some of that earth that's over there in the forest is really good, and like infusing it with the earth that's here in the garden. Yeah. Huh. Yeah. What else? Yeah, I guess so. In the springtime over here, I look forward to planning out this and just kind of throwing the seeds out and just seeing what they do with, you know, because last year was pretty good. We didn't have to do much. We got a lot of productivity out of the youth garden. That was a Leaf Sunday Leaf Live, Sunday Instagram Live Leaf lesson. It's on the biogeochemical cycles, or I'll just say ecological cycles. Everyone, you all know what this is a big word, but the water cycle and company. Um, yeah. So I hope you guys got something from it. Of the importance of these cycles and and how uh, how to incorporate them into our decisions and practical lives. Yeah. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks,
Bye.
Nate. Bye, everybody.